Hello, Jason here for Educational Renaissance. Today I'd like to talk with you about why the history of narration matters. And this is the first part of a new series on this topic. Today I'm going to look in particular at the question of whether Charlotte Mason discovered narration, or did she, as I contend, adapt it as a practice from the classical tradition, specifically the rhetorical tradition. I'm putting a hold on the series I've been working on, which is on Bloom's taxonomy versus Aristotle's intellectual virtues. If you've been following, you may know that I've been working on that, and I decided that I had to put a hold on it and come back to Charlotte Mason and the history of narration. And the reason for that is that I recently contracted with Classical Academic Press to film 2 courses at the beginning of December for them, for Classical U, on narration first, Charlotte Mason's practice of narration and how classical schools can implement it. And then secondly, Charlotte Mason's philosophy and how we can approach Charlotte Mason's philosophy as classical educators. So I'm really excited about that, and I just knew that I had to focus on deliberately preparing. So I wanted to return to some things that I've been thinking about for a while, especially on narration and Charlotte Mason's relationship to the classical tradition. It has actually been quite a long time since I've written on narration for Educational Renaissance. The last article that I shared was entitled Narration as Flow in the Flow of Thought series, where I looked at how narration is one of the best activities that could help to create this flow experience for students in the classroom. Flow is when your skills meet your current level of challenge and you go into this timeless experience of focus on a meaningful activity. I think Charlotte Mason's practice of narration does that. So that I wrote just shortly after launching the How to Implement Narration in the Classical Classroom ebook that has been way more popular and successful than I would have imagined when I first launched that last September. And don't worry, I've actually taken that down now because it's being incorporated into a classical guide to narration, which is coming out with Circe Institute soon here. But I've put something else up, Charlotte Mason and the Trivium, planning lessons with narration as another equivalent resource for you. So if you haven't checked that out, that's new up there in the last month here. So go ahead and find that. But it's been a while since I've written about narration or talked about it, but that doesn't mean that it hasn't been on my mind a lot. I've been thinking about narration for the last year almost continuously. After all of that, in the winter, I really did a lot of the major legwork in terms of research and writing for turning that ebook into this full-length book with Circe, a classical guide to narration. So I was lugging stacks of books home, and while my wife was doing voice lessons in the evening, and I was taking care of our 2 kids, I would be finding some ways to work ahead and do that research, write, filling out those footnotes, thinking through and writing new chapters for that book. So that was winter. There was no other time. It had to happen, pushed forward, and it was a great experience. A lot of more thinking and kind of crystallizing of my views on narration during that time. And then last spring, as I began discussions with Coram Deo Academy about me coming to be the principal, one of the big topics, kind of my one must-have, was implementing narration. Narration, to me, is so central for a really challenging, rich educational experience. And so that was kind of in dialogue there. And then this last summer, as many of you know, I was able to share about narration and how to implement narration with so many different educators at a number of different conferences, from ACCS to the Society for Classical Learning, the University Model Schools International, and then even the Circe Institute. So it was a rich summer of sharing that basic core message about narration. Made me think about it so much and think about what really stands out about narration. Then, of course, in August, trained the faculty of Coram Deo Academy here, helped train Ecclesial Schools Initiative for Kevin Clark over in Florida. Shout out to them. They're doing some great work over there. And then also even with Ravi Jain, we worked in a kind of poetic knowledge course, I, and two other educators to train a whole bunch of Asian Christians. And I put the practice of narration up there as a really important thing. So it's just been exhilarating to be able to think about all this. I know it may have sounded exhausting. It was a little bit of that too, but to be able to think about narration and share narration is just a dream come true. I think it's so important, so powerful. And like I said, a great joy and exhilaration for me to get the opportunity to share about Charlotte Mason's practice in this way. And as I've thought about it over this whole course of time, the thing that I think I've really discovered or hit upon that's new and I think powerful and important is this long history of narration, going back before Charlotte Mason's day in the rhetorical and grammatical tradition of classical education. So I'd like to unpack that. And I think it's so important because I think this history of narration piece can actually go some way toward bridging the gap between Charlotte Mason educators on the one hand and classical Christian educators on the other. These two groups that are sometimes at odds. So let me jump in then with that question. Charlotte Mason versus classical Christian education. You know, there are some out there who have emphasized the differences and tried to put up a fence between Charlotte Mason as an approach to education and classical Christian education. And while there's something to that, they're not the same thing by any stretch of the imagination. I'd like to bridge that gap. One person in particular who's talked about this is Art Middlecoff of Charlotte Mason Poetry. And he has contended that Charlotte Mason had as the main source for her educational theory the Gospels, science, and her own observation of children. That's how she got her theory. That's how she went about coming up with the right way to do education. She looked to the Gospels, to science, advancing science, and her own observations. Whereas he would say the classical tradition or classical Christian educators look back to the great kind of philosophers of education, to Plato and Aristotle, Quintilian, and so on. And I think this is actually a false dichotomy, or it's a little bit of a simplistic reduction of Mason herself. I think he had to pick and choose his evidence to really get there. There are many references in Charlotte Mason to great classical educators and thinkers of education, including Plato, Aristotle, and others, including later people in the tradition like Bacon and Coleridge, who are explicitly engaging with this tradition of thought, philosophy about education. Charlotte Mason even talks about this herself in her 6th volume, Toward a Philosophy of Education, when she says explicitly of her educational theory, some of it is new, much of it is old. Some of it is new, much of it is old. And that, I think, could be said by pretty much every great philosopher of education in the tradition of educational philosophy, in the classical tradition. They would all have something new to offer, and they would say that much of what they're saying is really old. I think that's just how it works for any educational philosopher. And so I don't think we should let ourselves get put into this false dichotomy, this either or of either we look to the past thinkers in education or we draw from modern research or some kind of pure reading of scripture or our own observation of children, as if those were two different options. Of course, when we're dealing with a topic like education and the theory behind it, we're going to be engaging with both. You can't not be dependent on those thinkers who came before. And if you're not doing your own observation of children, if you're not looking to what modern research in the social sciences and what we know from brain, about how the brain works and trying to put those two things together, then I think we're really actually missing something crucial. I think this whole question is in some ways a little bit silly because it doesn't really make sense to oppose two different things, right? To do a comparison and contrast between apples and oranges, right? Between one thinker on the one hand versus this whole tradition doesn't make sense, because unless you think that the tradition is one simple, monolithic, single voice that says all of exactly the same things about education, it doesn't make sense to put one thinker up against the whole thing. That's not the way the classical tradition is, even if sometimes we have thought about it that way or expressed it that way. Classical education is blank, as if there's one definition, one exact look at it. That's not how many thinkers about classical education are talking about it now. I can think of hearing Chris Perrin share about classical education being a pull toward what is best from the past, right? Like savoring the best version of education that we can find. And I really think we should think of the classical tradition as this history of discovery, this great conversation about education that has many different little instantiations of it, all of which we can learn from, none of which is authoritative on its own, must be done this way for every time, place, and culture. So if you think about it, we could do this same thing with, opposing Charlotte Mason to the classical tradition. We could do that with Plato. Plato, as a single thinker, has a gap between him and what the tradition as a whole says. We could do that with Aristotle. We could do that with Locke or Quintilian or Augustine or any other great educational thinker. You could put them up and say, how does their version of proper education, the best sort of education, compare and contrast with the classical tradition as a whole? And that's because you're dealing with a particular here and a generalization of the tradition over here. And there's always going to be a gap between those things, whatever person you pick. So hopefully that just puts aside let's not oppose Charlotte Mason to the classical tradition, because the classical tradition isn't one monolithic thing that only draws from one source. Classical educators throughout the ages have not just looked back to earlier classical educators and said, let's do things exactly the way they did. No, they've critiqued the tradition. They've observed children for themselves and tried it out in their own classrooms. And they've developed more and added to the tradition along the way. So let's not have this false dichotomy. I think the history of narration as a practice in particular is a test case for this, because we can look at it and say, hey, is narration Charlotte Mason's discovery? Or is it a practice from the tradition that Charlotte Mason applied in a new way and maybe gave new life to and new insight into how to use it best? And I think it's the latter. I don't think it's simply Charlotte Mason's discovery. Now, as I say that, I think we need to deal with the fact that Charlotte Mason does talk in some ways at times as if narration or something like that was her discovery. She's very willing to talk about the ways that advancing science is helping her out and the ways that her unique, Parents National Education Union is seeing incredible results because of what they've discovered together. And I think that's fair. And let me tell you how I work those two things out. I know very well that Charlotte Mason at no point explicitly says of narration, hey, I got this from John Locke, which is, by the way, my personal theory based on some of the language and phrasing and exact details of her first passage on narration in home education. I think that she was reading and engaging with John Locke, and the passage where he talks about narration. John Locke, by the way, is drawing from Quintilian's recommendations to do the same, and you can see that through kind of numerous similarities where they're drawing from one another. That all aside, Charlotte Mason never says that or draws attention to that, and I think there's a good reason why. Before that, though, let's deal with the fact that Charlotte Mason claims to discover something new. And she talks about it at the beginning of her 6th volume, Toward a Philosophy of Education. She does concede that she was, quote, reading a good deal of philosophy and education at the time that she came to this discovery, as she thinks about it. And I would note also that she explicitly referenced Plato's forms for her philosophy of how the mind feeds on ideas and the importance of ideas and curiosity and all of that for how narration works, or the exact methods that she proposes to get the sort of results where day in and day out students can attend. There's this remarkable paragraph in the introduction to that 6th final volume at the end of her life where she's reflecting on this, where she says, "It's difficult to explain how I came to this, the solution to this problem, how to secure attention." And so we could think about that, and you can obviously see how it sounds like she's saying she discovered this new idea. And we could put narration in there and say narration was what she discovered to secure attention as a major kind of technique or tool or method. What I want to draw attention to there is that I think she's actually talking about how she discovered a series of principles for how to make the attention of children work. And what she discovered there was not narration itself as a tool. After all, we could see contemporaries at her time across the Atlantic in America, a couple rhetorical teachers, Frederick Scott and Denny, who write this educational book on composition that recommend exercises just like narration, that students would do exercises just like narration. No, but what Charlotte Mason had discovered was a particular way of doing book-based education that had narration at its core, and a particular set of ways of doing narration that actually worked to draw out the natural curiosity of children. Right? You need a rich text full of living ideas. There needs to be the right atmosphere in the classroom of natural love for learning. There needs to be the active training in the habit of attention by the teacher. There needs to be this moral impulse that students have through having narration occur right after the reading. So there's all these little details of making narration optimal, making it work perfectly in a line with human nature, that Charlotte Mason claims to have discovered and articulated well for the first time. So I think that solves the problem of looking at Charlotte Mason, hearing her rhetoric about narration and the discoveries that she made, and explaining that what she says can be true, and the details of narration that she's expressing can come from new principles that she's articulating and dealing with for the first time. Not that they were absent from the tradition, but she's kind of putting all the pieces together in a new way in one new area. Some of it is new, much of it is old. The pieces there are old. Narration itself is old, as we'll discover in the next article in this series. But the way that she puts it together is new. And I think that's significant. I think that helps us to bridge the gap. And again, I think this means that since Charlotte Mason is drawing from the classical tradition for those pieces in this way, classical Christian educators should legitimately look to her and engage with new puzzle that she's tried to solve in how to secure attention for our children. Think about this: if you're a classical Christian educator and you haven't practiced narration or tried to put it into practice yet, do you ever struggle with the question that Charlotte Mason struggled with? How can we secure attention from our children day in, day out, and train that up so that they can take in as much content as possible? Do you ever struggle with that? Maybe you should think about narration. Maybe you should go to that page on Educational Renaissance, learn more. Download my new ebook, Charlotte Mason and the Trivium, and engage with this. When the book comes out through Circe Institute, A Classical Guide to Narration, engage with this question with me and Charlotte Mason. And if you're on the Charlotte Mason side of the spectrum, you're a Masonite. You do a Charlotte Mason education all the way, trying to apply it faithfully to this situation of education, whether it's home education or a Charlotte Mason school. Maybe you should think about these broader questions. How was Charlotte Mason engaging with the broader tradition? How can your modern Charlotte Mason movement engage with the broader history in a way that ultimately helps you do what Charlotte Mason was trying to do in developing a holistic theory of education for children as whole persons, a liberal education for all movement, as she herself called it. Maybe, just maybe, if we classical Christian educators and we Masonites dialogue and engage around this, we'll all be better for it, and we'll see more and more of an educational renaissance among us. Again, Jason Barney for Educational Renaissance. Hope that was inspiring to you. Look out for the next installment in the series in a few weeks, and have a great rest of your day.